There was, Miss Marple often reflected, no habit more revealing than the way people behaved around sandwiches. Some took the last one while apologizing prettily. Some refused twice before accepting. Some rearranged the plate to conceal greed. Others watched what everyone else selected and adjusted their own choice accordingly. Human nature, she had long ago decided, appeared most clearly in small domestic moments. It was with this comforting thought that Miss Jane Marple sat beside the tall, mullioned window of Willowbrook Hall, balancing a china cup delicately upon her knee, while rain tapped faintly against the glass beyond. The annual harvest relief tea had drawn nearly the whole village of Marlacombe together despite the weather. Wet umbrellas leaned in clusters near the front entrance. The drawing-room smelled pleasantly of furniture polish, chrysanthemums, and warm seed cake. Lady Rose Ashcombe, large and pink-cheeked beneath an extravagant lavender hat, presided over the gathering with determined cheerfulness. "We must all be grateful," she declared loudly, "that the storm held off long enough for the vicar's little procession. Last year was a complete disaster. Chickens escaped into the churchyard." "Turkeys," corrected Colonel Harbury from beside the fire. Lady Rose waved a dismissive hand. "They were certainly some sort of bird." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. Miss Marple smiled faintly and accepted another small sandwich from Gladys Trent, the vicar's niece, whose anxious efficiency had already caused her to drop 2 teaspoons and spill milk upon the curate. "Thank you, dear," said Miss Marple gently. Gladys flushed. "I'm all fingers today. I don't know what's wrong with me." Miss Marple thought she knew perfectly well. Gladys's eyes had drifted no fewer than 6 times toward Gerald Fenwick, the handsome young solicitor standing near the piano. Mr. Fenwick, meanwhile, appeared entirely occupied in conversation with Sylvia Dean, a dark-haired widow whose elegance had caused considerable unrest among the married women of Marlacombe since her arrival 6 months earlier. Village life, Miss Marple knew, was rarely peaceful beneath the surface. At the far side of the room, Dr. Lionel Greaves was speaking in his usual sharp, impatient voice. "I tell you plainly, Ashcombe, these endless charity committees will be the death of me before medicine manages it." Sir Edmund Ashcombe laughed good-humouredly. "You'd complain if there weren't any committees." "That," replied the doctor, "is entirely beside the point. Sir Edmund was master of Willowbrook Hall and one of the oldest residents in the district. Though nearing 70, he remained upright and energetic, with iron-grey hair and the weathered complexion of a man who spent much of his life outdoors. He was, by nearly everyone's account, a thoroughly admirable gentleman, which was perhaps why Miss Marple noticed immediately that several people in the room seemed uneasy around him that afternoon. Not fearful exactly, guarded. It was visible only in fragments, a hesitation before speaking, an exchanged glance, a silence arriving too quickly. Most people would not have observed it at all. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly. Near the fireplace stood Clara Whitmore, companion to Sir Edmund's unmarried sister, Aunt Beatrice. Clara was pale and sensible-looking, with an expression of permanent nervous restraint. She kept folding and unfolding her gloves. Beside her lounged Rupert Vale, an unsuccessful artist who had lived for years in a cottage on Ashcombe Land while producing alarming paintings nobody understood. Rupert said lazily, "If this rain worsens, we shall all drown before supper." "You'd make a joke at your own funeral," Clara replied. "My dear Clara, one hopes especially then." Again the room laughed politely, but Clara did not. Miss Marple noticed that too. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 5. At almost the same moment the library door opened. A young maid appeared, breathless and rather pale. "If you please, Sir Edmund." Something in the girl's face altered the room at once. Conversation faded. Sir Edmund turned sharply. "Well, there's been an accident, sir." No one moved. The maid swallowed. "It's Mr. Pritchard, sir." In the study, a curious stillness followed. Then chairs scraped backward. Dr. Greaves was first across the room. "What sort of accident?" "I don't know, sir." Sir Edmund strode toward the hall with surprising speed. Several others followed instinctively, drawn by that dreadful human fascination with disaster. Miss Marple rose more slowly. The study lay at the rear of the house beside the old morning-room. By the time she reached the doorway, a small cluster had already formed outside. Inside, Dr. Greaves knelt beside the body. Mr. Arthur Pritchard, steward of the Ashcombe estate for nearly 20 years, lay sprawled awkwardly beside the writing-desk. One arm bent beneath him at an impossible angle. There was blood on the carpet, quite a great deal of blood. Lady Rose gave a muffled cry behind Miss Marple. Dr. Greaves looked up grimly. "He's dead." Rain rattled suddenly against the windows. Sir Edmund stared at the body in blank disbelief. "That's impossible. I spoke to him less than half an hour ago." The doctor rose slowly. "He's been struck on the head." "Ha! Likely with that." He indicated the bronze fireplace poker lying near the hearth. Trent gasped audibly. Rupert Vale muttered, "Good Lord!" But Miss Marple's attention had shifted elsewhere. The fireplace itself was cold. No fire had been lit there all day, yet faint black soot dusted the edge of the rug beneath the mantel. And Sir Edmund, though standing perfectly still, had gone extraordinarily white. The police arrived from Much Benham shortly before 6:30. Inspector Harold Finch was a stout, capable-looking man with thinning hair and the patient expression of someone long accustomed to village melodrama. He examined the room methodically while a constable took statements from the guests. The body had not been moved. Miss Marple remained seated quietly in the drawing-room while nervous conversations swelled and faded around her like troubled tides. Murder, she reflected sadly, altered a house immediately. One felt it almost physically, a loosening of comfort, a disturbance in ordinary rhythm. Even the teacups seemed wrong afterward. Lady Rose sat dabbing at her eyes. "I cannot understand it. Arthur had no enemies." "Everyone has enemies," said Dr. Greaves curtly. "That is an extremely unpleasant thing to say. It also happens to be true." Gerald Fenwick entered from the hall looking strained. "The inspector wishes nobody to leave tonight." "Well, naturally," said Rupert Vale. "One of us has apparently developed homicidal tendencies." Gladys gave a tiny squeak. "Do stop talking like that." Rupert bowed slightly. "My apologies." Miss Marple observed him thoughtfully. People often joked when frightened. Others became silent. Some grew talkative. Human beings rarely changed fundamentally under pressure. They merely became more themselves. Inspector Finch eventually entered the drawing-room accompanied by Sir Edmund. "I'm afraid," he announced, "this is now officially a murder investigation." There was a murmur. Finch continued calmly. "Until we establish the facts, I must ask everyone present to remain available for questioning." Sir Edmund spoke heavily. "Of course." The inspector consulted a notebook. "Mr. Pritchard was apparently last seen alive at approximately 4:30. Several of you were in other parts of the house during the next half hour." His gaze moved carefully across the room. "Did anyone hear an argument?" No one answered immediately. Then Clara Whitmore spoke softly. "I heard voices in the corridor." Inspector Finch turned. "What sort of voices?" "I couldn't distinguish words, but Mr. Pritchard sounded upset." "Was he alone?" Clara hesitated. "I think Sir Edmund was with him." Every eye in the room shifted. Sir Edmund's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. "We discussed estate accounts." Inspector Finch nodded. "Did you quarrel?" "Certainly not." But Miss Marple noticed that Sir Edmund avoided looking directly at Clara Whitmore. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting indeed. It was nearly 8 o'clock before Miss Marple finally prepared to leave. The rain had eased into drifting mist outside. Lamps glowed softly along the village lane beyond Willowbrook Hall. Gerald Fenwick insisted upon walking her to the gate. "I do hope this dreadful business hasn't upset you too badly, Miss Marple." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple kindly, "one becomes accustomed to unpleasant things if one lives long enough." He smiled faintly. Then his expression clouded. "It's all rather shocking." They walked a few paces in silence. Then Miss Marple said casually, "Mr. Pritchard seemed a very respected man." Gerald hesitated. "He was efficient, but not liked." "Oh, people liked him well enough." That, Miss Marple thought, was not an answer. She said mildly, "He appeared worried lately." Gerald glanced at her sharply. "Did he?" "Appeared worried lately." Gerald glanced at her sharply. "Did he?" A pause. Finally Gerald said quietly, "Pritchard knew a great many things about people in Marleycombe." "And knowledge," said Miss Marple softly, "can sometimes be dangerous." He gave her an odd look. "Good night, Miss Marple." "Good night, Mr. Fenwick." Miss Marple continued slowly down the lane beneath the drifting fog. Somewhere an owl called. The village seemed peaceful once more. Yet beneath that peace something had shifted violently out of place. And as she walked, Miss Marple found herself thinking not of the poker beside the body, but of the soot near the cold chimney, because soot, like human nature, rarely appeared without reason. By the following morning Marleycombe had divided itself neatly into 3 categories: those who were frightened, those who were excited, and those who claimed firmly to be neither while displaying every symptom of both. Miss Marple, seated beside the window of her modest cottage on High Street, observed the transformation of village life with quiet attention, while knitting a pale blue sleeve of uncertain dimensions. Outside the rain had cleared entirely. Sunlight rested softly upon wet hedgerows, and the church bells carried through the crisp autumn air with deceptive cheerfulness. Murder always looks strange against ordinary weather. Her maid, Florence, entered carrying toast and marmalade. "They're saying at the baker's it was robbery," she announced immediately. "Indeed?" "Yes, miss, though Mrs. Phelps says it was foreign agents." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Foreign agents are very fashionable explanations nowadays." Florence lowered her voice. "And Mrs. Carter swears the steward had a lady hidden somewhere." "That," said Miss Marple mildly, "is much more probable." Florence looked disappointed by this lack of drama. "I told them you'd know the truth before long." "My dear Florence, I know nothing at all." But as she spoke, Miss Marple's eyes drifted once again toward the memory of the cold fireplace in Sir Edmund's study. Something about it troubled her profoundly, not because it was dramatic, because it was untidy. Real crimes, she had often found, resembled careless housekeeping. Small inconsistencies revealed themselves like dust beneath furniture, and soot where no fire had burned was decidedly untidy. The village shop proved even busier than usual that morning. Women who ordinarily completed purchases in 6 minutes lingered near the counter for nearly 40. Eggs, sugar, and tea were bought with extraordinary frequency by people who had no earthly need for them. Miss Marple entered shortly after 11 and found Mrs. Phelps already established beside the biscuit tins like a general commanding troops. "My dear Miss Marple," cried Mrs. Phelps eagerly. "Terrible business." "Yes, indeed. I said immediately it couldn't possibly be simple." Miss Marple selected a jar of jam. "Did you?" "Oh, yes. Arthur Pritchard was far too clever to get himself murdered ordinarily." This remarkable sentence appeared to satisfy Mrs. Phelps entirely. From near the window came another voice. "I heard the police search the study till midnight. It was Edith Lane, the postmistress, who possessed the rare village gift of appearing accidentally wherever important information existed." Mrs. Phelps lowered her tone theatrically. "They say Inspector Finch questioned Sir Edmund for nearly an hour." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Really?" "Oh, certainly. Though naturally they won't arrest him." "No," agreed Miss Marple quietly. "Probably not." Mrs. Phelps leaned closer. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, there must have been money involved." "Why particularly money?" "Well, men always murder each other over money." Miss Marple considered. "Not always." Mrs. Phelps blinked. "My dear Miss Marple, what else is there?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A great many things." Inspector Finch arrived at Willowbrook Hall shortly before noon to continue his inquiries. The atmosphere inside the house had altered noticeably overnight. Servants moved nervously. Doors closed too softly. Even the clock seemed to tick with unusual caution. Sir Edmund received the inspector in the morning room with visible strain. "You've discovered something?" "Possibly." Finch removed his gloves deliberately. "We've established that Mr. Pritchard intended meeting someone privately yesterday afternoon." Sir Edmund frowned. "That," said Finch, "is precisely what I'd like to know." A silence followed. Then Finch added, "There's another matter." Sir Edmund stiffened almost imperceptibly. The housemaid states she saw soot on Mr. Pritchard's cuffs shortly before his death. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed Sir Edmund's face. "That makes no sense." "No," agreed Finch calmly. "It doesn't." Sir Edmund turned abruptly toward the window. Outside, gardeners worked among the rose beds as though nothing at all had changed. Finch watched him carefully. "You seem troubled by that detail, Sir Edmund." After a pause, Sir Edmund said heavily, "Because the chimney in that room hasn't been used in years." Miss Marple spent the afternoon visiting her old friend Mrs. Bantry in the neighbouring village of Roushill, where murder remained the preferred topic over sponge cake and seed biscuits. Mrs. Bantry listened avidly while pouring tea. "A steward murdered in the study? It sounds exactly like something from a lending library thriller." "Real life is usually both duller and sadder," Miss Marple replied. "But surely someone in the house knows something." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "Almost certainly several people." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "And Sir Edmund?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I do not think he killed Mr. Pritchard, but you suspect him of something." "My dear Dolly," said Miss Marple gently, "everybody in Marleycombe is concealing something at present." The difficulty lies in deciding which secret matters." Mrs. Bantry sighed happily. "I do adore hearing you say things like that." Miss Marple smiled absently. Her thoughts had drifted elsewhere entirely, toward Clara Whitmore. The nervous companion had spoken reluctantly during Inspector Finch's questioning yesterday, too reluctantly for invention, and yet she had seemed genuinely frightened afterward. Not frightened of murder, frightened of consequences. There was a distinction. Human beings feared scandal far more consistently than death. That evening brought the first true shock. At 7:30, Inspector Finch returned unexpectedly to Willowbrook Hall carrying a leather document case. The remaining household gathered uneasily in the drawing-room. Lady Rose clutched a handkerchief. "What is it now?" Finch spoke without ceremony. "We've discovered that several papers are missing from Mr. Pritchard's desk." Sir Edmund looked sharply up. "What papers?" "We're still determining that." Gerald Fenwick frowned. "The desk was locked." "Exactly." Finch opened the case slowly. "However, we did recover this." He removed a folded sheet of yellowed paper, stained faintly grey along one edge. Rupert Vale whistled softly. "It looks ancient." Inspector Finch nodded. "It was found inside the chimney in the study." At those words, Miss Marple, who had been invited by Lady Rose for supper and sat quietly near the fire, looked up very suddenly. The inspector continued. "The paper appears to be part of a letter." Sir Edmund had gone completely still. Finch unfolded the brittle sheet carefully. Only a fragment remained legible. "If Edmund discovers the truth, everything will be ruined." The room fell silent. Then Lady Rose whispered, "Edmund?" Inspector Finch's eyes rested steadily upon Sir Edmund Ashcombe. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is precisely what concerns me." No one spoke for several moments after Inspector Finch finished reading the fragment aloud. The silence had a peculiar density to it, as though the room itself were listening. Lady Rose lowered herself slowly into a chair. "I do not understand," she said faintly. Neither, Miss Marple reflected, did anyone else. But confusion affected people differently. Some rushed to explain. Others retreated inward. A few became angry simply because uncertainty offended them. Sir Edmund Ashcombe belonged unmistakably to the last category. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "A torn scrap of paper proves nothing." Inspector Finch folded the fragment carefully. "No one suggested otherwise." "Then why produce it in front of everyone like some theatrical conjuring trick?" "Because," said Finch evenly, "Mr. Pritchard concealed it inside the chimney shortly before his death." That altered the atmosphere immediately. Gerald Fenwick leaned forward. "How can you possibly know that?" "The soot on the paper is recent. Also, the maid recalls seeing Mr. Pritchard in the study shortly before tea began. He was alone at the time." Rupert Vale stretched lazily in his chair. "So our dead steward was hiding mysterious letters up chimneys. One begins to regret not knowing him better. Must you joke about everything?" Clara Whitmore asked suddenly. Her voice trembled. Rupert glanced at her, surprised. "My dear Clara." "No," she said quickly. "It's horrible." Miss Marple observed her quietly. Clara's distress appeared entirely genuine. Yet it was not the letter itself that frightened her most. It was Sir Edmund. Though outwardly composed now, he had become unnaturally rigid since the fragment was produced. His fingers gripped the arm of his chair with almost painful force. Inspector Finch turned toward him again. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Sir Edmund answered too quickly. "No." The inspector nodded slowly, as though storing the response away carefully for later examination. Miss Marple thought, that was unfortunate, because truth, when immediate, tended to sound different. The gathering dissolved soon afterward into uneasy fragments of conversation. Lady Rose retired complaining of nerves. Rupert wandered toward the billiard-room in search of whiskey. Gerald Fenwick offered to help Inspector Finch examine estate documents. Only Clara Whitmore remained standing uncertainly near the fireplace. Miss Marple approached her gently. "You are tired, dear." Clara startled slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple, you ought not to distress yourself." Clara gave a strained smile. "I wish everyone would stop saying that. One cannot help being distressed when a man has been murdered 3 rooms away. No, indeed." They stood together a moment. Then Miss Marple said mildly, "You knew Mr. Pritchard rather well, I think." Clara hesitated. "He managed most household matters." "But not warmly?" The younger woman looked surprised. "Why do you say that?" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "people who genuinely like someone never describe them as efficient first." A faint color rose in Clara's face. "He could be unpleasant sometimes." "In what way?" "Controlling, perhaps. He liked knowing things about people, Again, Miss Marple heard the same implication. Knowledge. Hidden leverage. Very often murder followed naturally behind such things. And were there secrets at Willowbrook Hall? Miss Marple asked softly. Clara's eyes widened. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Sir Edmund appeared in the doorway. At once Clara withdrew into herself visibly, like a person stepping indoors from cold wind. "There you are," Sir Edmund said curtly. "Lady Beatrice is asking for you." "Yes, Sir Edmund?" She hurried away almost immediately. Miss Marple watched her go. Then she turned calmly back toward Sir Edmund. "Poor girl," she said. "She seems very nervous." Sir Edmund poured himself brandy from a decanter near the fire. "She's overly sensitive. That can be difficult." "Yes," he said shortly. "It can." He drank too quickly. Miss Marple noticed that as well. When Miss Marple returned home that evening, she found Florence waiting with unconcealed excitement. "A policeman came, miss." "Indeed? He wanted to know if you'd seen anyone near the hall yesterday before tea." Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "And had I?" Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "And had I?" Florence leaned forward. "Well, had you?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Florence, if one tells policemen everything immediately, they become dreadfully lazy." Florence looked deeply impressed by this philosophy. Over supper, Miss Marple reflected quietly upon the day's events. The letter fragment troubled her less for what it said than for what it implied. If Edmund discovers the truth, such phrases rarely referred to financial matters alone. There was emotion buried beneath those words, fear, perhaps shame. And why hide the fragment in the chimney, not destroy it? That suggested urgency rather than calculation. Miss Marple buttered another piece of toast thoughtfully. People often behaved irrationally under emotional strain. They hid objects in absurd places, teapots, coal scuttles beneath mattresses, or chimneys. Suddenly she paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly, because something else had occurred to her. If the paper had been hidden hastily in the chimney, why had there been soot already upon the rug before the murder? The following morning brought a fresh development. News travelled through Marlacombe shortly after breakfast that Inspector Finch had made an arrest. By 10 o'clock the village hummed like disturbed bees. Miss Marple learned the details from Dr. Greaves, who arrived at her cottage looking grimly satisfied. "They've arrested Rupert Vale." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Have they indeed?" "He was in debt to Pritchard." "That's hardly unique. There's more. Finch discovered they quarrelled violently last week over unpaid rent." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Rupert?" "Claims he's innocent, naturally." Dr. Greaves accepted tea impatiently. "The fellow's exactly the sort for it, if you ask me. Idle, theatrical, unstable." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes," she murmured. "Perhaps." The doctor frowned. "You disagree?" "My dear Dr. Greaves, I merely observe that obvious people are very often innocent." "Nonsense. Not at all. Real guilt usually behaves more carefully." Dr. Greaves snorted. "You always say things that sound simple until one tries understanding them." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. Outside, church bells drifted faintly across the village green. Dr. Greaves rose after a moment. "Well, Finch seems confident enough. They found traces of blood on Vale's coat sleeve." "Did they?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused again. That sounded convincing. Too convincing, perhaps. She looked toward the window where sunlight touched the garden path softly. Then she said almost to herself, "And yet someone still hid that letter." Rupert Vale spent the afternoon in a holding cell at Much Benham police station protesting his innocence with intermittent irritation. Inspector Finch listened patiently. "You had motive. So have half the county? You argued with Pritchard. I argued with everybody. It saves time." Finch remained unmoved. "And blood was found on your cuff." Rupert laughed suddenly. "Ah, that's beautiful. You find this amusing?" "I find it tidy." The inspector studied him carefully. "Tidy?" "Yes. Debt, quarrel, blood-stain all arranged neatly together like clues in a dreadful detective novel. You deny the stain is Mr. Pritchard's blood." "I deny murdering anyone." Rupert leaned back against the bench. "Besides," he added quietly, "if I had killed Arthur Pritchard, I assure you I should have enjoyed it enormously. One ought never murder without enthusiasm." Finch sighed. "You're not helping yourself." "My dear Inspector," said Rupert mildly, "I suspect someone else is helping me far too much." Rupert Vale's arrest transformed Marlacombe completely. Until then, the murder of Arthur Pritchard had possessed the uneasy unreality of a storm glimpsed from indoors. But once the police produced a suspect, people relaxed into certainty with remarkable eagerness. Human beings, Miss Marple often thought, preferred incorrect explanations to none at all. By Thursday morning the village had largely agreed Rupert was guilty. Mrs. Phelps announced loudly at the butcher's that artists were temperamental creatures. The vicar's wife declared she had always distrusted men with velvet collars. Even Edith Lane at the post office began speaking of Rupert in mournful tones usually reserved for public hangings. Only Miss Marple remained unconvinced, not because Rupert seemed virtuous, he did not, but because the case against him possessed an artificial neatness which troubled her profoundly. Real wickedness, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, was untidy. It spilled. It contradicted itself. It rarely arrived gift-trapped with motives and bloodstains arranged conveniently together. She was thinking precisely this while pruning late roses in her garden when Gerald Fenwick appeared at the gate. The young solicitor looked exhausted. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" "Of course, dear boy." She led him into the sitting-room where Florence brought tea with visible curiosity before lingering unnecessarily near the door. Gerald waited until they were alone. "I don't believe Rupert did it." Miss Marple handed him tea calmly. "No? He's reckless and irritating and impossible, but not murderous. Yet the evidence appears strong." "That's precisely what troubles me." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully over her spectacles. "It troubles you because someone wished it to appear strong." Gerald looked sharply up. He lowered his voice instinctively. "There's something wrong at Willowbrook Hall." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple gently, "there usually is when somebody ends up dead." Gerald almost smiled. Then his expression darkened again. "Pritchard had been behaving oddly for weeks, secretive, nervous. I once found him searching Sir Edmund's private desk after dinner. That is interesting. I asked what he was doing. He claimed Sir Edmund requested papers." "And did Sir Edmund?" "No." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Did you tell anyone?" Gerald hesitated. "No." "Why not?" He looked uncomfortable. "Because Sir Edmund seemed frightened afterward." That, Miss Marple thought, was an unusually revealing word. Not angry, frightened. Later that afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Willowbrook Hall under the perfectly respectable excuse of returning a misplaced umbrella. The atmosphere inside the house had deteriorated noticeably since Rupert's arrest. Servants whispered in corners. Doors closed abruptly as one approached. Even Lady Rose's determined hospitality had begun to crack around the edges. She greeted Miss Marple with obvious relief. "My dear Miss Marple, how comforting to see a sensible face." "That is very kind." Lady Rose sank heavily into a chair. "I cannot bear this dreadful tension. And now the newspapers are telephoning." "Yes," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "Reporters are often worse than murderers." Lady Rose gave a weary laugh. "You don't think Rupert really did it, do you?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "I think Inspector Finch believes he did." "That isn't an answer." "No," agreed Miss Marple softly. "It rarely is." Before Lady Rose could pursue the matter further, Clara Whitmore entered carrying correspondence. She looked paler than ever. "Oh, Miss Mark, my dear." Clara nearly dropped the letters while arranging them on the table. Her hands shook visibly. Lady Rose frowned. "You really must rest, Clara. You look dreadful." "I'm quite all right," but she clearly was not. Miss Marple noticed something else as well. There was soot upon Clara's sleeve, only a faint smudge, but unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes rested there briefly. Clara saw the glance instantly and pulled her hand back. A tiny movement, yet filled with alarm. Interesting, thought Miss Marple again. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Finch arrived shortly before dinner carrying an expression of restrained satisfaction. "We've uncovered additional evidence against Vale." Sir Edmund looked up sharply from beside the fire. "What evidence?" "A witness places him near the study shortly before the murder." Rupert, Miss Marple reflected privately, was becoming almost absurdly guilty. Lady Rose clasped her hands. "Then it's settled?" Finch hesitated very slightly. "Not entirely." Sir Edmund frowned. "What now?" The inspector removed a notebook. "One matter still troubles me. We cannot determine what happened to the remainder of the letter found in the chimney." Silence flickered briefly across the room. Then Sir Edmund said curtly, "Surely the rest was burned." "No signs of burning." "Then Pritchard destroyed it elsewhere." "Possibly." But Finch did not sound convinced. Miss Marple watched Clara Whitmore carefully. The young woman had gone utterly still, like prey listening for danger. Dinner that evening proceeded under immense strain. Conversation lurched awkwardly between weather, parish matters, and determined silences. Only Rupert's absence seemed truly present at the table. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, Sir Edmund's elderly sister, finally spoke during the fish course. "I never liked Arthur Pritchard." The statement startled everyone. Sir Edmund looked annoyed. "Really, Beatrice, no point pretending now." Lady Beatrice sniffed. "The man was impertinent." Lady Rose attempted diplomacy. "He was efficient." Yes, everyone says that after unpleasant people die." Miss Marple nearly smiled into her soup. Human honesty often emerged unexpectedly with age. Lady Beatrice continued. "He listened outside doors." Sir Edmund set down his wine-glass sharply. "That is enough." But Miss Marple had already noticed something important. Lady Beatrice was not afraid of speaking. Unlike the others, fear moved invisibly through the household like cold air beneath a door. Yet its source remained uncertain. The true shock came later that night. Shortly after 11, the housemaid Ellen screamed. The sound shattered the quiet of the hall completely. Doors flew open upstairs. Footsteps thundered across corridors. Miss Marple, staying overnight at Lady Rose's insistence due to worsening fog, emerged into the landing just as Inspector Finch, who had remained in the house reviewing papers, rushed past. Ellen stood trembling near the old east staircase. "She's dead," the girl sobbed. "Oh, Lord, she's dead." "Who?" demanded Finch. The maid pointed downward helplessly. Clara. Whitmore lay at the foot of the stairs, her body twisted unnaturally among the shadows. Lady Rose gave a choking cry. Dr. Greaves, summoned instantly from his room, knelt beside the fallen woman. Only seconds passed before he looked up grimly. "She's gone." Sir Edmund gripped the banister rail. "How did this happen?" Inspector Finch descended slowly, studying the staircase. Then his eyes narrowed. At the top of the stairs, nearly invisible against the dark carpet-runner, lay a broken fragment of silk cord stretched tightly between the banisters. Deliberate. Finch's expression hardened immediately. This wasn't an accident. Miss Marple stood perfectly still. Her gaze rested not upon the dead girl, but upon Clara's right hand. Even in death her fingers remained clenched tightly around something blackened and fragile. A scrap of burnt paper. Death altered Willowbrook. Hall a second time. After Arthur Pritchard's murder, the house had become uneasy. After Clara Whitmore's death, it became afraid. Fear moved openly now through corridors and drawing-rooms alike. Servants jumped at footsteps. Doors were locked unnecessarily. Meals were eaten quickly and with little conversation. And somewhere within the hall, Miss Marple thought, sat a person who had now killed twice. That changed matters considerably. Inspector Finch took immediate control of the household. No one was permitted to leave. Statements were taken again, this time with sharper urgency. The body had been removed shortly before dawn. Only the stain upon the carpet-runner remained. Miss Marple sat quietly in the morning-room while the pale October light crept through lace curtains. Lady Rose dozed fitfully nearby, exhausted by shock and sleeping powders. From the corridor beyond came the murmur of police voices. Miss Marple's knitting rested untouched in her lap. Her thoughts remained fixed upon the burnt scrap found in Clara Whitmore's hand, not because it solved anything, because it suggested desperation. People did not clutch burnt paper while falling to their deaths, unless they believed it mattered very greatly indeed. Inspector Finch entered at last looking tired and irritable. "Well," he said heavily, "we can now eliminate any theory involving coincidence." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yeah." The inspector removed his spectacles. "She was murdered because she knew something, or because someone feared she did." Finch studied her a moment. "You think there's a difference?" "Oh, yeah," said Miss Marple softly. "A very large one." He sat opposite her. "The paper fragment in her hand matches the letter from the chimney." Miss Marple was unsurprised. "And very little remains legible after burning." He consulted a notebook. "Only a few words." "What words?" Finch glanced up. "Before the child learns." Miss Marple became very still. The inspector noticed immediately. "That interests you." "My dear inspector," she said carefully, "children are very interesting in village matters, even when they are no longer children." Finch frowned faintly. "I'm not sure I follow." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "Possibly not yet." Breakfast that morning proved a miserable affair. Sir Edmund appeared older by 10 years. Lady Beatrice remained unusually silent. Gerald Fenwick looked as though he had not slept at all. Only Dr. Greaves retained his practical briskness. "A tragic business," he declared, "but at least it clarifies matters. Clara must have discovered Rupert killed Pritchard." Miss Marple buttered toast thoughtfully. "Why must she?" The doctor stared. "Well, because Rupert silenced her." Inspector Finch spoke before anyone else could. "Rupert Vale was locked in a police cell all night." An uncomfortable silence followed. Dr. Greaves cleared his throat. Lady Rose whispered, "Then someone else here?" No one answered, but everyone thought it. Later that morning Miss Marple wandered slowly through the Hall gardens with Gerald Fenwick. Mist still lingered faintly over the lawns. The yew hedges stood dark and motionless in the damp autumn air. Gerald looked deeply troubled. "I keep thinking about Clara. She was frightened for days." Miss Marple glanced sideways at him. "You were fond of her?" He hesitated. That single syllable contained more feeling than all his previous conversation. Miss Marple nodded gently. "She trusted you?" "I think so." "And yet she told you nothing?" Gerald stopped walking. "She tried to." Miss Marple waited. "Yesterday afternoon," he said quietly, "she came to my office in the village. She was terribly upset. Said there was something wrong at the Hall, something hidden for years." "What exactly?" "She wouldn't explain. She only kept saying Arthur Pritchard had discovered the truth." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And then?" "She became frightened suddenly, as though she regretted speaking at all." "Did she mention the letter?" Gerald shook his head. "But she asked me an odd question." "What question?" He looked uncomfortable. "She asked whether old family records could be altered legally." Miss Marple stopped walking very slowly. Above them rooks circled against the pale sky. "My dear," she said at last, "that is a very remarkable question indeed." That afternoon Inspector Finch ordered a complete search of Clara Whitmore's room. Miss Marple observed part of it quietly from the doorway. The room itself was painfully neat. Clara had clearly belonged to that anxious type of woman who fought inner disorder by arranging external objects carefully. Drawers aligned perfectly, shoes paired exactly, letters bundled with ribbon. And hidden beneath the false bottom of her writing-case, Inspector Finch discovered a photograph. He held it up silently. The picture was old, perhaps 25 years old, faded around the edges. It showed a young woman standing beside a handsome dark-haired officer in military uniform. The woman was unmistakably Lady Rose Ashcombe in youth. The officer was not Sir Edmund. Inspector Finch looked thoughtfully at the back of the photograph. There, in faded ink, appeared a short inscription. "To Rosalie until everything changes. Julian." Miss Marple heard Lady Rose gasp sharply behind her. The single word sounded almost like pain. Inspector Finch turned carefully. "You recognize him?" Lady Rose pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Sir Edmund, standing rigid near the window, said coldly, "Julian Meredith." No one spoke. The room seemed suddenly colder. Miss Marple watched Lady Rose closely. The poor woman had gone completely pale. Finally Finch asked quietly, "And who was Julian Meredith?" Lady Rose looked helplessly toward her husband. But it was Lady Beatrice who answered from the doorway. "The man Rosalie was supposed to marry." The silence that followed felt enormous. Inspector Finch lowered the photograph slowly. "I see." "No," said Lady Beatrice sharply. "You don't." She entered fully into the room, leaning heavily upon her cane. Julian Meredith vanished before the wedding. 25 years ago. Lady Rose whispered before the wedding. 25 years ago. Lady Rose whispered, "Beatrice, please." But the older woman continued relentlessly. "He disappeared 2 days before the ceremony. No explanation. No farewell. Simply vanished." Inspector Finch frowned. "What became of him?" "No one ever discovered." Sir Edmund's voice cut across the room like a blade. "And this has absolutely nothing to do with murder." Miss Marple looked at him quietly, but she noticed something extraordinary. For the first time since Arthur Pritchard's death, Sir Edmund Ashcombe looked genuinely afraid. That evening Miss Marple sat alone beside the dying fire in her guest-room, reflecting carefully upon human nature. Young women fell in love. Young men made promises. Families concealed scandals. None of that surprised her. But secrets buried for decades possessed peculiar power. They grew quietly in darkness, twisting themselves into other lives, like roots beneath a house foundation. The letter fragment returned again to her mind. If Edmund discovers the truth, and now, before the child learns, Miss Marple's knitting needles remained motionless, because at last she had begun to glimpse the shape of something dreadful, not merely blackmail, not merely murder. but an old deception, one that had survived for years because respectable people preferred silence to scandal. Outside, the wind stirred softly against the windows. Then, from somewhere far below in the hall, came the sound of a door closing quietly. Miss Marple lifted her head. A moment later came footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Very soft footsteps, then silence. Miss Marple sat perfectly still. At her age, she had long ago learned an important truth. People creeping about at midnight rarely intended anything innocent. Miss Marple remained motionless beside the fire. The footsteps outside her door had ceased entirely now, yet she felt quite certain someone still stood in the corridor beyond, waiting, listening perhaps. The old house seemed full of tiny sounds, settling floorboards, wind brushing ivy against stone, the faint ticking of the landing clock. Then came another noise, very slight, the careful turning of a doorknob farther down the passage. Miss Marple rose quietly and crossed to her bedroom door. Opening it only an inch, she peered into the dim corridor. At first she saw nothing. Then a figure moved near the staircase below. A woman, wrapped in a dark dressing gown, descending cautiously toward the east wing. Miss Marple recognized Lady Rose immediately. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting indeed. The following morning dawned gray and windy. Branches scraped restlessly against the windows of Willowbrook Hall while breakfast proceeded under oppressive silence. Lady Rose appeared exhausted. Sir Edmund scarcely touched his food. Inspector Finch arrived shortly after 9 with a grim expression suggesting little sleep and less patience. "We've received new information from London," he announced. Everyone looked up sharply. "It concerns Julian Meredith." Miss Marple noticed Lady Rose's hands tighten violently around her teacup. Inspector Finch consulted several papers. Julian Meredith did not vanish voluntarily 25 years ago. A hush settled over the table. He withdrew a substantial sum from his bank 3 days before his disappearance, Finch continued. Then nothing further. No passport use, no employment records, no military contact. Lady Beatrice frowned. So, said Finch carefully, modern review suggests the possibility that he may never have left England at all. Lady Rose gave a faint sound. Sir Edmund spoke abruptly. "This is absurd speculation. Perhaps." Finch folded the papers slowly. "But there is another matter." No one moved. A witness from Much Benham remembers seeing Arthur Pritchard recently examining old parish records concerning the Meredith family. That landed heavily. Miss Marple looked toward Gerald Fenwick. The young solicitor had gone visibly pale. Inspector Finch's gaze moved around the room deliberately. "It appears Mr. Pritchard became interested in events from 25 years ago shortly before his death." Sir Edmund pushed back his chair suddenly. "This has become grotesque." Without another word he strode from the room. Lady Rose closed her eyes briefly as though exhausted beyond speech. Miss Marple buttered toast thoughtfully. Because now matters were becoming clearer. Not entirely clear, but clearer. And clarity, she knew, could be dangerous. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked into Marlacombe Village with Inspector Finch. The inspector had finally reached the stage familiar to many policemen before him of half mistrusting and half relying upon Miss Marple's instincts. "You know something," he said abruptly as they passed the churchyard. "My dear Inspector, everyone knows something." "You know what I mean." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The autumn air smelled of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke. A postman cycled past, slowing instinctively in hope of overhearing scandal. Miss Marple said quietly, "When people conceal old family matters, it is usually for one of 3 reasons." Finch sighed patiently. "And those are? Money, marriage, or children?" "That's rather broad." "Human beings are rather broad, Inspector." He almost smiled despite himself. "You think the letter concerns one of those?" "Oh, yes." "And Julian Meredith?" Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently from her wrist as she walked. "I think Julian Meredith is important because someone wishes very desperately that he should not be." Finch glanced sideways at her. "You suspect Sir Edmund?" "No." The answer came instantly. The inspector looked surprised. "You don't?" "I think Sir Edmund is frightened," said Miss Marple softly. "But frightened people are not always guilty. Sometimes they merely know guilt exists." Finch was silent for several steps. Then he said, "And Lady Rose?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because she had indeed been thinking about Lady Rose, about the midnight journey through the corridor, about the old photograph hidden in Clara's room, about a woman carrying some burden silently for 25 years. At last Miss Marple said, "I think Lady Rose has been unhappy for a very long time. The true breakthrough came unexpectedly that afternoon. Dr. Greaves arrived at the hall carrying an old leather medical ledger. "I nearly forgot this existed," he announced. Inspector Finch looked up sharply. "What is it?" "Patient records from my father's practice. He was village doctor before me." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fire, became immediately attentive. Dr. Greaves flipped through yellowing pages. "When you started prattling about Meredith and old scandals, I remembered father mentioning the affair years ago." "What affair?" asked Finch. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "Lady Rose's illness before her marriage." The room went still. "What illness?" Finch asked carefully. Dr. Greaves frowned at the page. "That's odd." "What?" "No diagnosis listed." Inspector Finch stepped closer. Miss Marple rose too. The ledger entry had clearly been altered. Several lines were scratched heavily through with ink, yet beneath the crossing marks faint words remained partly visible. "Child healthy, arrangements discreet." Lady Rose uttered a soft cry from the doorway. Everyone turned. She stood frozen there, white as paper. The ledger slipped from Dr. Greaves's fingers onto the carpet. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, because now she understood at last, or nearly. A child, a vanished fiancé, a hurried marriage afterward, and Arthur Pritchard searching parish records. The pieces aligned themselves with terrible elegance. Inspector Finch spoke slowly. "Lady Rose," but she suddenly turned and fled the room. Miss Marple found her half an hour later in the neglected winter garden behind the east conservatory. The older woman sat upon a stone bench among dead vines and cracked flower-pots, trembling violently. Miss Marple approached gently. "My dear." Lady Rose covered her face. "I cannot bear it any more." Miss Marple sat beside her quietly. For a long while neither spoke. Then Lady Rose whispered, "I love Julian very much. He promised he would return before the wedding." Miss Marple waited patiently. Lady Rose's voice shook. "When he disappeared, everyone thought he abandoned me. But he had not." "No." The word came almost inaudibly. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "You had already discovered you were expecting a child." Lady Rose began to cry silently. There it was at last, not spoken in gossip, not hinted, simply true. Miss Marple rested one gentle hand over the other woman's trembling fingers, and someone helped conceal it. Lady Rose nodded weakly. "Sir Edmund." Miss Marple was unsurprised. "He married you knowing." There was deep affection in the way she said it. Deep gratitude, too. "Edmund saved me," Lady Rose whispered. "In those days—" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "People could be very cruel." Lady Rose stared into the dead winter roses. "We were told the baby died shortly after birth." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. "Told?" Lady Rose looked up slowly, and in her face Miss Marple suddenly saw the full horror of it. "I never saw the child myself." For several moments after Lady Rose spoke, the winter garden remained utterly silent save for the faint tapping of bare branches against the conservatory glass. Miss Marple did not interrupt. One learned at her age that truths forced too quickly often retreated again. Lady Rose sat very still, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. "They told me," she whispered, "that the baby was weak, that it survived only a few hours." Miss Marple said gently, "And you believed them?" "What else could I do?" A bitter little smile crossed Lady Rose's face. "I was 22, terrified, and half the county already suspected disgrace." She looked suddenly older than before. "Sir Edmund arranged everything. Nursing home, and Dr. Greaves's father attended?" Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully toward the dead rose vines. "There must have been others involved as well." Lady Rose nodded faintly. "A nurse from London. And Arthur Pritchard." Miss Marple became still. He was Sir Edmund's secretary then. Ambitious, completely devoted to Edmund. The old lady gave a shiver. "He handled letters and arrangements afterward." Miss Marple thought, "Of course he did." A clever man trusted with dangerous secrets often discovered the value of them eventually. "And recently," Miss Marple asked softly, "Mr. Pritchard discovered something new." Lady Rose closed her eyes. "I think he learned the child never died." Inspector Finch listened to the confession grimly in Sir Edmund's library an hour later. Rain had begun again outside, rattling softly against the windows. Lady Rose sat pale but composed beside the fire, while Sir Edmund stood near the mantelpiece with rigid dignity. He looked exhausted. Miss Marple knitted quietly in the corner while Finch took notes. "You're certain the child was reported dead? And you never questioned it?" Lady Rose, "Child was reported dead. And you never questioned it? Lady Rose gave a sad smile. In 1931, Inspector, unmarried women did not question respectable men very often. Sir Edmund spoke suddenly. I believe the child died as well. Finch looked up sharply. You had no part in deceiving Lady Rose? None whatsoever. Miss Marple believed him, not because he sounded convincing, because his distress possessed genuine bewilderment beneath it. A guilty man might fear exposure. Sir Edmund feared discovery of something he himself had never understood. Inspector Finch leaned back thoughtfully. So Arthur Pritchard uncovers evidence the child survived. He attempts blackmail, perhaps. No, said Miss Marple quietly. Everyone turned toward her. The old lady laid down her knitting. Blackmail is usually vulgar and direct. Mr. Pritchard's behavior was different. How so? Asked Finch. He was frightened. Inspector Finch frowned. Why would he be frightened if he held the advantage? Miss Marple folded her hands. Because discovering a secret is one thing. Discovering that someone else knows you discovered it is another entirely. A silence followed. Then Sir Edmund said slowly, You believe Arthur was killed because he learned the child survived. And Clara? Miss Marple's expression saddened. Poor Clara learned too much afterward. The question now haunting Willowbrook Hall was obvious. If the child had survived, where was it now? Or rather, Miss Marple thought privately, who was it now? The village itself buzzed with feverish speculation by evening. Mrs. Phelps informed 3 separate customers at the butcher's that the missing child was almost certainly foreign. Edith Lane became convinced inheritance fraud was involved. The vicar's wife began speaking darkly about sins returning after years. Only Miss Marple continued quietly observing, because one fact troubled her more than any other. Arthur Pritchard had hidden the letter fragment instead of bringing it openly to Sir Edmund. If his loyalty remained intact, he would have spoken directly. Unless, Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, unless the truth endangered Sir Edmund personally, not socially, legally perhaps, or emotionally. Human beings, she reflected, often committed terrible acts not for gain but protection. That evening Gerald Fenwick came to see Miss Marple privately. The young solicitor appeared deeply shaken. You know now, don't you? Miss Marple smiled gently. One knows many things gradually. Gerald paced nervously before the fire. I can't stop thinking about Clara. She told me something else before she died. Miss Marple looked up sharply. What? Gerald hesitated. She said Arthur Pritchard had found proof in the parish records. What sort of proof? That a birth certificate had been altered. Miss Marple became very still. Outside, rain swept softly across the dark windows. Altered how? She asked. I don't know. Clara never explained fully, but she was frightened. Gerald rubbed tiredly at his forehead. She kept saying the wrong person had been living the wrong life for 25 years. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened immediately. The wrong person, wrong life. Now at last the thing approached coherence. Not merely concealment, substitution. Later that night Inspector Finch requested access to the Marleycombe Parish Archives. The records occupied a cold stone room behind the church vestry and smelled strongly of dust, damp paper, and age. Miss Marple accompanied him with quiet determination. The vicar unlocked cabinets nervously. I do hope this unpleasantness won't involve the church directly. It already does, said Finch dryly. Hours passed among ledgers and certificates. Marriages, names faded brown with time. At last Finch gave a sharp exclamation. Here! Miss Marple leaned closer. The record showed a male child born October 3, 1931. Mother, Rosalie Meredith. The surname had clearly been altered later. Above Meredith now appeared another name in darker ink. Inspector Finch frowned. That confirms Lady Rose's story. Yes, murmured Miss Marple. But look beneath. Finch adjusted the lamp. There, almost invisible beside the entry, appeared a second notation added weeks later. Child transferred to guardianship of M. Trent, Marleycombe. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, quick beat. Trent, Finch repeated slowly. The vicar's family? The inspector stared at her. You think the child was raised here in the village? Miss Marple looked quietly toward the dark church windows. I think, she said softly, the child may never have left Marleycombe at all. The realization changed everything, because Miss Marple knew the Trent household perfectly. The previous vicar and his wife had indeed taken in an infant unexpectedly many years ago after a distant cousin's tragedy. Everyone in the village remembered it vaguely, and now only one member of that household remained. Gladys Trent. Miss Marple sat very still. Poor nervous Gladys, always eager to please, always anxious, always uncertain of herself. A child raised upon secrecy often became exactly that sort of adult. Inspector Finch spoke slowly. "You believe Gladys Trent is Lady Rose's daughter. But if Arthur Pritchard discovered it, he may have tried contacting someone connected with the original deception." Finch frowned. Miss Marple looked at him gravely. "That," she said, "is the question upon which 2 murders depend." At that precise moment footsteps echoed suddenly in the church corridor outside. Heavy footsteps. Then the unmistakable sound of someone running. Inspector Finch extinguished the reading lamp instantly. The parish archive room plunged into darkness. For one brief moment neither he nor Miss Marple moved. Then the footsteps came again, rapid now, retreating along the stone corridor beyond the vestry. Finch swore softly beneath his breath. "Stay here." But Miss Marple had no intention whatsoever of remaining behind while important things occurred elsewhere. By the time Finch reached the church door, she had already followed him into the passage. Cold air swept inward from outside. The outer vestry door stood open, and beyond it, through drifting rain and moonlit mist, a figure in a dark coat could be seen hurrying across the churchyard. "Stop!" shouted Finch. The figure ran faster. Finch gave chase immediately, boots striking sharply against wet stone. Miss Marple remained beneath the church archway watching carefully. At her age one rarely improved investigations by sprinting through graveyards at midnight. Observation proved much more useful. The fleeing figure moved awkwardly. Not young, then, perhaps male, and limping slightly. The shape vanished through the lich gate just as Inspector Finch reached the lower path. A moment later came the distant sound of a motor car starting violently. Then silence. Finch returned several minutes later, breathing hard and distinctly annoyed. "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "I feared they might be." The inspector frowned at her. "You noticed something?" "The person limped." Finch looked surprised. "So they did. And they knew exactly where we were." He glanced back toward the archive room thoughtfully. "Meaning someone overheard us discussing Gladys Trent." Rain drifted softly through the churchyard mist. Inspector Finch said quietly, "Then Gladys may be in danger." The vicarage lights still burned when they arrived 20 minutes later. Gladys herself answered the door in a wool dressing-gown, looking startled and pale. "Inspector? Miss Marple? Has something happened?" Miss Marple observed her carefully. The girl's nervousness appeared genuine, but then Gladys always seemed nervous. The vicar's wife emerged behind her carrying a candle. "Really, Inspector, it's after midnight. I apologize, Mrs. Trent, but I need to ask Gladys several questions immediately." Fear flickered visibly across the older woman's face. Miss Marple noticed that too. Very few people, she reflected, received unexpected midnight visits from police with complete serenity. They gathered in the narrow drawing-room where dying coals glowed faintly in the grate. Inspector Finch wasted little time. "Gladys, were you adopted?" The girl stared blankly. "What? Do you know whether you were adopted as an infant?" Mrs. Trent gave a sharp little cry. "Oh!" Gladys turned slowly toward her aunt. "Aunt Margaret?" The older woman sat down heavily. "I always prayed this would never happen." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. Yes, she thought sadly. Most secrets begin that way. The truth emerged slowly and painfully. 25 years earlier, the former Reverend Trent and his wife had indeed taken in a newborn infant under conditions of absolute secrecy. Mrs. Trent dabbed helplessly at her eyes while speaking. "We were told the mother was a young widow. Respectable family, terrible circumstances. And the child?" asked Finch. "We agreed to raise her as our own relation." Gladys sat perfectly motionless. "You knew?" "Only recently," whispered Mrs. Trent, "after Arthur Pritchard visited." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "When was this?" 3 weeks ago." Inspector Finch leaned forward. "What exactly did Pritchard say?" Mrs. Trent hesitated. "He asked questions about Gladys's birth, old arrangements." "Did he mention Lady Rose?" "No." "Bah!" He seemed frightened. Again that word. Frightened. Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened further. Inspector Finch continued. "And afterward?" Mrs. Trent looked miserably toward Gladys. "He returned 2 days later, demanding letters." "What letters?" "Letters left with the baby originally." Miss Marple sat very still. "The hidden letter." "Of course. What became of them?" Finch asked. Mrs. Trent's face crumpled. "I burned them." A silence followed. Then Gladys spoke for the first time. "My whole life—" Her voice sounded distant. Mrs. Trent reached helplessly toward her. "We loved you dearly." Gladys gave a strange little laugh. "I don't even know who I am now." Miss Marple's heart tightened painfully. Identity, she reflected, mattered deeply to quiet people. They built themselves carefully around certainty. To discover suddenly that one's entire beginning had been fabricated, that could wound profoundly. Inspector Finch requested to see whatever remained of the letters. Mrs. Trent shook her head weakly. Nothing survived except one fragment. Arthur Pritchard took it. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Finch. The Chimney letter. Naturally. "But why would Pritchard hide it afterward?" Finch murmured. Miss Marple answered softly. "Because someone frightened him before he could act." The inspector rose slowly. "And that someone followed us to the church tonight." As they prepared to leave, Gladys suddenly spoke again. "There was one other thing." Everyone turned. She stood near the dying fire, twisting her hands tightly together. "Mr. Pritchard asked whether I remembered a silver locket." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. "A locket?" Gladys nodded uncertainly. "He said I wore one as a baby." Mrs. Trent looked startled. "Oh, Lord!" Inspector Finch said quickly. "You still have it?" "No." Mrs. Trent answered instead. "It disappeared years ago." "When?" "I can't remember exactly." But Miss Marple noticed the hesitation immediately. The older woman did remember, and she was afraid. Miss Marple said gently, "My dear Mrs. Trent, please try." The woman pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. "It vanished after Julian Meredith came to the village." Complete silence followed. Inspector Finch stared. "Julian Meredith came here?" Mrs. Trent nodded weakly. "About 8 years ago. Briefly. He called himself something else at first, but I recognized him from an old photograph." Miss Marple felt the final pieces beginning to shift rapidly into place. Julian Meredith had not vanished forever. He had returned. Inspector Finch spoke sharply. "What happened then?" Mrs. Trent whispered. "He wanted to see the child." The room seemed suddenly colder. Gladys looked utterly bewildered. "You mean my father?" "Yes," said Mrs. Trent tearfully. "But why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because Sir Edmund forbade it." Inspector Finch looked up sharply. "Sir Edmund knew Meredith was alive." Mrs. Trent nodded. "He came to the vicarage that same night. There was a terrible argument." Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly now. Julian returns secretly. Seeks his daughter. An argument follows. And afterward? "What became of Julian Meredith?" she asked softly. Mrs. Trent stared into the fire. "He disappeared again the next morning." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple asked the question that truly mattered. "Did anyone ever see him leave Marleycombe?" Mrs. Trent looked up slowly. "No." The drive back to Willowbrook Hall took place in complete silence. Rain swept across the windscreen in silver ribbons, while Inspector Finch drove with tense concentration through the narrow village lanes. Beside him Miss Marple sat very still. Julian Meredith alive, returned secretly to Marleycombe 8 years earlier, seen by Mrs. Trent, argued with Sir Edmund, then vanished once more. It was no longer merely a murder investigation. It was becoming an excavation, layer after layer of concealment emerging from beneath years of silence, and somewhere within those buried years Miss Marple felt certain lay the explanation for Arthur Pritchard's death. Inspector Finch finally spoke. "If Meredith never left the village, he may have been murdered years ago." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Possibly. But by whom?" Sir Edmund received them in the library shortly after 1 in the morning. He was still fully dressed, standing beside the dead fireplace with a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. Interesting, thought Miss Marple. A guilty man often drank too much. A frightened man frequently forgot to drink at all. Inspector Finch wasted little time. "You told me Julian Meredith vanished 25 years ago." "He did. He returned 8 years ago. For the first time since the murders began, Sir Edmund appeared genuinely stunned." "Why?" Miss Marple watched closely. The reaction was not feigned. Inspector Finch continued relentlessly. Mrs. Trent identified him positively. She states he visited the vicarage seeking Gladys. Sir Edmund slowly lowered the whiskey glass. "Good God! You deny knowing this?" The answer came immediately. Miss Marple believed that too, because shock, unlike deceit, often appeared first in the eyes, and Sir Edmund's had gone utterly blank. Inspector Finch studied him carefully. "Mrs. Trent also claims there was an argument afterward involving you." Sir Edmund stared. "With me?" "That's impossible." Silence followed. Then, quite suddenly, Sir Edmund sat down heavily. Miss Marple saw the precise moment understanding struck him. Not complete understanding, but enough. He looked older than ever before. "My sister," he said quietly. Inspector Finch frowned. "Lady Beatrice?" Sir Edmund nodded slowly. "She handled everything after Julian disappeared originally. Arrangements." Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened instantly. Lady Beatrice, sharp-tongued, entirely unafraid, and unlike the others, she had shown no surprise whatsoever at recent revelations. Interesting indeed. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe received them in her upstairs sitting-room with remarkable composure for a woman awakened after midnight by police. She sat upright in bed beneath a lace shawl, looking more irritated than alarmed. This had better be important. Inspector Finch remained standing. "Did Julian Meredith return to Marlacombe 8 years ago?" Lady Beatrice looked directly at him. No hesitation, no shock, simply admission. Sir Edmund stared at his sister in disbelief. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. Why in God's name did you say nothing?" Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. "Because Julian Meredith was a weak fool whose return threatened to ruin Rosalie's life all over again." Miss Marple watched her carefully. The old woman spoke with certainty born not of malice but conviction. People committed dangerous acts most easily when persuaded they were morally correct. Inspector Finch said sharply, "What happened when Meredith returned?" Lady Beatrice adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "He wanted money." Sir Edmund made a sound of disgust. "So that was it."
"Oh, yes."
He spoke romantically enough about seeing the child, but money was the true object. Miss Marple intervened quietly. "Did Lady Rose know he returned?" "No." The answer came instantly. "I made certain of that." Inspector Finch narrowed his eyes. "You met Meredith alone? What happened afterward?" Lady Beatrice's gaze drifted briefly toward the dark window. "I paid him to leave." "And did he?" A pause. "I assumed so." Miss Marple noticed the wording immediately. Not certainty. The interview ended shortly afterward, but Miss Marple remained troubled. Very troubled indeed, because Lady Beatrice had lied. Not entirely, only slightly. Yet slight lies were often more revealing than large ones. Miss Marple sat awake late into the night, turning matters carefully over in her mind. Lady Beatrice possessed intelligence, determination, and a fierce protective instinct toward her family. Quite enough for concealment, possibly enough for murder. And yet something still did not fit. Arthur Pritchard had hidden the letter fragment in terror. Clara Whitmore had died clutching burnt paper. Both victims had been silenced quickly after learning the truth. That suggested not merely secrecy, but panic. Suddenly Miss Marple's eyes opened wider, because at last she understood the significance of the soot, the chimney, the burnt paper. Not hiding. Someone had searched the chimney after Pritchard concealed the fragment there, and in haste they had left soot upon the rug. Miss Marple rose quietly and crossed to the window. Outside, the whole grounds lay dark beneath drifting mist. Somewhere in the house a murderer remained awake. The next morning brought catastrophe. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe was gone. Her bed had not been slept in. The servants discovered the room empty shortly after 7. Inspector Finch reacted instantly. Searched the grounds. Rain fell steadily as policemen spread across gardens, stables, and woodland paths surrounding the hall. Miss Marple stood beneath the front portico beside Lady Rose, who trembled visibly beneath a wool coat. "Do you think she's run away?" Lady Rose whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because fleeing rarely suited women like Lady Beatrice. Women accustomed to command generally stayed and fought. At 8:30 a constable came running from the direction of the old boathouse near the lake. Inspector Finch moved at once. Miss Marple followed more slowly. The boathouse stood half hidden among dripping willows at the edge of the water. One door hung partly open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and stagnant lake water. Lady Beatrice lay upon the floor beside an overturned lantern. A dark bruise marked one temple. Inspector Finch knelt grimly beside the body. No signs of drowning. Miss Marple's gaze moved quietly around the boathouse. Then she saw it. Near the old rowing skiff, half concealed beneath a tarpaulin, stood a large traveling trunk coated with dust. One strap had broken recently. Inspector Finch noticed it too. He rose slowly. "Open it!" A constable obeyed reluctantly. The trunk creaked upward. Lady Rose gave a terrible cry. Inside lay human bones, carefully wrapped in rotting military blankets. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. because she already knew whose bones they must be. Julian Meredith had never left Marleycombe at all. He had remained here for 8 years. The discovery of Julian Meredith's body shattered the last illusion of safety surrounding Willowbrook Hall. Not scandal now, not suspicion. Murder. Cold, deliberate murder hidden for 8 years beneath the Ashcombe estate itself. Rain drummed heavily upon the roof of the boathouse while Inspector Finch stood staring grimly into the open trunk. Lady Rose had collapsed onto a nearby bench, white and trembling beyond speech. Sir Edmund looked as though the world beneath his feet had shifted violently. Only Miss Marple remained outwardly calm, because, dreadful though the discovery was, it clarified matters enormously. Julian Meredith had not abandoned his child. Someone had prevented him from returning. Inspector Finch spoke quietly to the constable beside him. "Send for Dr. Greaves immediately, and the county forensic team." The constable hurried away. Miss Marple moved slowly nearer the trunk. The military blankets surrounding the remains had decayed badly, yet fragments of dark officer's cloth remained visible beneath, and around one skeletal wrist still clung the rusted remains of a watch-chain. A soldier, a father, a man buried not from hatred perhaps, but fear. Inspector Finch turned suddenly toward Sir Edmund. "You truly knew nothing about this?" Sir Edmund stared at the trunk in horror. Nothing. Miss Marple believed him entirely now, because no performance could imitate such devastation. Lady Rose whispered faintly, "Julian!" Her voice broke completely. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. "My dear." Lady Rose looked up with tears filling her eyes. "He came back for her." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think he did." By noon the hall had become a place of police activity and whispered panic. News travelled through Marleycombe with astonishing speed. Villagers gathered in little knots near shops and gates despite the rain. The words skeleton, boathouse, and old murder passed breathlessly from mouth to mouth. Mrs. Phelps reportedly declared herself unsurprised by everything nowadays. Inspector Finch established temporary headquarters in the library while forensic men examined the remains. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire listening. Dr. Greaves emerged finally from the study looking grave. "The skull fracture appears consistent with blunt force trauma." "Murder?" asked Finch. "How long ago?" "Roughly 8 years fits." The inspector nodded slowly. "So Julian Meredith returns to Marleycombe, visits the vicarage, disappears afterward, and ends up hidden in the Ashcombe boathouse." Sir Edmund sat with bowed head near the window. "Dear God!" Inspector Finch's eyes shifted toward the staircase. "And now Lady Beatrice is dead as well." No one spoke, because the implication hung there plainly enough. Lady Beatrice had known about Julian, perhaps too much, and now she too was dead. Miss Marple spent the afternoon observing people carefully. In murder cases, she had long found, truth frequently appeared not during dramatic revelations, but afterward in the subtle rearrangement of human behavior. Gerald Fenwick had become restless and distracted. Lady Rose seemed crushed beneath genuine grief. Dr. Greaves displayed increasing impatience. And Gladys Trent. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Gladys was changing. The timid uncertainty that usually surrounded the young woman had begun giving way to something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or anger. Miss Marple found her standing alone in the conservatory shortly before tea, staring out toward the rain-soaked gardens. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you ought not remain alone too long." Gladys gave a faint start. "You are bearing a great deal all at once." The girl laughed nervously. "That seems to happen rather often here lately." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "You loved the people you believed were your family, and now you feel guilty for questioning them." Gladys looked up sharply. "How did you know?" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "people are wonderfully alike." Gladys's composure wavered suddenly. "I don't know who I'm supposed to hate." Miss Marple considered that carefully. A remarkably intelligent sentence. Hatred, she reflected, often sought certainty just as love did. Gladys whispered, "If my father was murdered, if everyone lied—" "Yes?" The girl swallowed hard. "Then someone at the Hall killed him." Miss Marple did not answer, because that too was becoming increasingly clear. That evening Inspector Finch gathered the household together once more in the drawing-room. Rain lashed against the windows while lamps cast long shadows across the walls. The atmosphere felt unbearable now, not merely tense but exhausted. People could sustain fear only so long before it hollowed them out entirely. Finch stood near the fireplace. "We now know Julian Meredith was murdered approximately 8 years ago." Lady Rose closed her eyes briefly. The inspector continued. "At that time only a small number of people knew Meredith had returned." His gaze moved carefully around the room. Lady Beatrice knew. Mrs. Trent knew. Arthur Pritchard eventually learned, and perhaps others. Gerald Fenwick spoke suddenly. "What about Clara?" Finch nodded. "Yes, Clara. Whitmore appears to have uncovered part of the truth recently." Sir Edmund looked up heavily. "And Beatrice?" The inspector's face hardened. "Lady Beatrice was struck from behind some time early this morning." Lady Rose whispered. "Then she was murdered too." A terrible silence followed. Then Gladys spoke quietly from near the window. "She knew who killed my father." Everyone turned toward her. The girl's face had gone pale but determined. Inspector Finch said carefully, "What makes you think that?" "Because Aunt Beatrice always watched me strangely." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened immediately. Gladys continued, "As though she pitied me." Sir Edmund stared at her. "My dear girl." "No." Gladys's voice trembled now. "Everyone keeps speaking gently instead of honestly." Miss Marple thought, "Quite right, too." Inspector Finch asked, "Did Lady Beatrice ever say anything specific?" Gladys hesitated. "Once? Years ago?" "Why?" "She told me some people are destroyed by weakness and others by loyalty." The room fell completely silent. Miss Marple felt the words settle into place almost audibly. Weakness, loyalty. Now they approached the heart of it. Later that night Miss Marple sat alone in the library beside the cold fireplace where Arthur Pritchard had died. The room smelled faintly of old paper and extinguished rain-damp ash. Her eyes rested thoughtfully upon the chimney breast. The hidden letter had begun everything. Or rather, the discovery of it had. But another thought now troubled her increasingly. If Julian Meredith had been murdered 8 years ago, why had Arthur Pritchard only recently become frightened? Surely he must always have known something. Unless... Miss Marple became very still. Unless Arthur had discovered not merely who killed Julian Meredith, and suddenly the entire pattern shifted. Miss Marple looked slowly around the darkened library. Human beings, she reflected, would kill for love, for shame, for fear, but most terribly of all, for protection of someone they could not bear to lose. At that precise moment she heard movement behind the library door, a soft sound, then the unmistakable click of the handle turning slowly. Miss Marple did not move. The library door opened very slowly, almost noiselessly, until a narrow strip of lamplight from the corridor touched the carpet. Then someone entered. Gerald Fenwick. He stopped abruptly upon seeing her seated beside the fire. Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear boy, people wandering about houses at midnight rarely improve their reputations." A faint flush crossed his face. "I couldn't sleep." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Very few people here can." Gerald hesitated near the doorway. Then, with visible effort, he crossed into the room. The old library seemed altered now by everything discovered within it. Shadows gathered thickly beneath shelves. The dead fireplace loomed like a dark mouth against the wall. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. "You wished to look for something." It was not a question. Gerald stared at her. "What makes you think that?" "My dear," she said kindly, "men who cannot sleep usually pace. Men who come directly to murder rooms after midnight generally seek objects." For a moment he looked almost alarmed. Then he gave a short laugh. "You miss absolutely nothing, do you?" "Only obvious things." He moved nearer the desk where Arthur Pritchard had died. "I wondered whether the police overlooked anything." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Possibly they have." Gerald looked sharply up. "What?" Miss Marple studied him quietly. "You cared for Clara Whitmore very deeply." His expression changed immediately. Not surprise, pain. "And she trusted you enough to tell you about altered records." Gerald turned away toward the fireplace. She was terrified. Not for herself initially. "No." Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. She feared for someone else. Gerald said nothing, but silence itself sometimes answered more clearly than words. At breakfast the following morning, Inspector Finch announced new forensic findings regarding Julian Meredith's remains. The skull fracture was inflicted by a narrow blunt instrument, he said. Possibly a walking stick or metal torch. Lady Rose shivered visibly. Sir Edmund sat pale and rigid beside her. Inspector Finch continued. "We also recovered fragments of cloth from the trunk lining." "What sort of cloth?" asked Dr. Greaves. "Women's wool." Miss Marple glanced quietly toward the empty chair where Lady Beatrice had once sat. Very interesting indeed. The inspector folded his notes. One further matter concerns me. No one spoke. Lady Beatrice was killed yesterday morning before she could tell us something important. Miss Marple watched Gerald Fenwick carefully at those words. A tiny movement crossed his face. Not guilt, recognition. Later that day Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Mrs. Trent. The vicar's wife received her nervously in the small parlour at the vicarage. Tea had been prepared but remained untouched. Mrs. Trent looked exhausted. "You've come about Gladys." The older woman twisted a handkerchief anxiously. "She's so unhappy." "That is understandable." Miss Marple waited quietly. At last Mrs. Trent said, "There's something else I never told Inspector Finch." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I thought there might be." Mrs. Trent looked startled. "How did you know?" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "people burdened by secrets always look relieved when one arrives to hear them." The woman gave a weak little smile. Then her expression darkened again. "The night Julian Meredith returned, he wasn't alone." Miss Marple became instantly attentive. "Who was with him?" "A child." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "A child?" "A little boy, about 10 perhaps." Mrs. Trent swallowed nervously. "Julian said he was his son." Silence filled the room. Miss Marple sat perfectly still, because suddenly an entirely new possibility opened before her. Julian Meredith had built another life elsewhere, another family perhaps, and returned not merely for Gladys, but with an heir. "Mrs." Trent whispered. "He wanted money from the Ashcombs, enough to start over properly." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yeah, that sounds plausible." There was terrible shouting later at the Hall, and after that Julian vanished. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The child vanished too? A cold sensation touched the back of Miss Marple's mind, because now the shape of the old crime changed once again. Not merely scandal, not merely concealment. Inheritance. That evening Inspector Finch received another startling report. The remains in the boathouse trunk had not been placed there immediately after death. Dr. Greaves explained carefully. "The bones show signs of earlier burial." "Buried where?" Finch demanded. "Impossible to say precisely, but the body was moved later." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the rain-dark windows. Moved. Hidden twice, which meant the killer had remained nearby long afterward, protecting the secret continuously. Inspector Finch spoke grimly. "So someone killed Meredith, buried him temporarily, then transferred the body into the boathouse later. And only household members could manage that unnoticed." No one argued, because everyone knew it was true. Near sunset, Miss Marple walked alone through the gardens toward the old orchard behind the Hall. The rain had finally stopped. Wet leaves glimmered copper and gold beneath fading light. She had been thinking all afternoon about children, about inheritance, about loyalty, and about something Lady Beatrice had said. Some people are destroyed by weakness, and others by loyalty. That sounded increasingly important. As Miss Marple approached the orchard wall, she noticed someone already standing there. Gladys Trent. The girl looked pale against the dark apple trees. "Oh, Miss Marple." "My dear." Gladys hesitated. Then she said abruptly, "Do you think my father was a bad man?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "I think," she said softly, "that Julian Meredith was probably weak, selfish, charming, and frightened." Gladys blinked. "That's very exact." "My dear, most people are combinations." The girl gave a faint, sad laugh. "He came back for me at least." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I believe he did." Gladys looked away toward the Hall. "Sometimes I think everyone here has spent years protecting lies." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened suddenly. Protecting, not creating. Protecting. And at that instant, quite suddenly, she understood. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to see the terrible simplicity beneath everything. Miss Marple became very still indeed, because the murders had not been committed to preserve the original secret. They had been committed to preserve someone from the consequences of it. Human beings, she reflected sadly, could endure guilt more easily than loss, and now she knew at last who feared loss most desperately of all. That night Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Inspector Finch in the library. The inspector arrived looking tired and suspicious. "Well?" Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "I think," she said, "we must arrange a small gathering tomorrow evening." Finch frowned. "A gathering?" "My dear Miss Marple, this is not one of your village teas." "No," she agreed softly. "It is something much more dangerous." The inspector stared at her. You know who the murderer is?" Miss Marple sighed gently. "And you've known for how long?" "Only completely since this afternoon." Finch leaned forward sharply. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. That's absurd." "No, Inspector." "Necessary." She looked toward the dark fireplace where Arthur Pritchard had died. "The murderer is frightened now, very frightened indeed, and frightened people often make mistakes if one presents them with the correct temptation." Inspector Finch studied her a long moment. Then slowly he said, "What sort of temptation?" Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly upon the chimney. "The opportunity," she said softly, "to destroy the last remaining piece of evidence." Miss Marple spent the following morning knitting calmly beside the drawing-room window, while Inspector Finch attempted unsuccessfully to disguise his impatience. "You still refuse to tell me," he said for perhaps the fourth time. "My dear Inspector, if one explains a trap beforehand, people develop a tendency to spring it accidentally." Finch frowned. "You're enjoying this?" "No," said Miss Marple gently, "not in the least." And indeed she was not, because beneath the satisfaction of understanding lay something infinitely sadder. The tragedy at Willowbrook Hall had not grown from monstrous wickedness. It had grown from ordinary human weakness, pride, fear, misplaced devotion. Such things were always more painful. Inspector Finch stood near the fireplace watching her sharply. "What exactly are we waiting for?" Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "For desperation." The gathering took place after dinner in the library. Rain battered softly against the windows while lamps cast warm pools of light across the room where Arthur Pritchard had died. Everyone was present. Sir Edmund sat pale and exhausted beside Lady Rose. Gerald Fenwick stood near the mantelpiece with folded arms. Dr. Greaves looked irritated by the entire affair. Trent remained very quiet near the window. Only the empty chair that had belonged to Lady Beatrice seemed to dominate the room invisibly. Inspector Finch cleared his throat. "Miss Marple has requested this meeting because she believes the case is nearing resolution." Several people stirred uneasily. Miss Marple folded her hands. "My dear friends," she said softly, "murders are very often less mysterious than people imagine. They arise from human emotions which are usually quite ordinary." No one interrupted. She continued gently. "A young woman falls in love. A child is born secretly. Respectable people panic." Lady Rose lowered her eyes. Years pass. The child grows safely hidden. Everyone convinces themselves the danger is over. Miss Marple's voice remained almost conversational. Then Julian Meredith returns unexpectedly. Sir Edmund stared into the fire. He wants money, perhaps, or reconciliation, or merely acknowledgment. Gladys looked very still now. "But his return threatens not only scandal," Miss Marple continued. "It threatens emotional catastrophe." Inspector Finch glanced toward her sharply. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "because by then everyone's loyalties have changed." Silence deepened in the room. Miss Marple looked quietly toward Lady Rose. "You loved Gladys as your daughter long before learning she truly was," Lady Rose whispered. "And Sir Edmund loved her too." Sir Edmund closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Quite naturally. He raised her indirectly for years, protected her, watched over her." Gladys stared at him in astonishment. Miss Marple continued. "Then Julian Meredith returns with demands, perhaps threatening to expose the truth publicly, perhaps threatening to take Gladys away entirely." A terrible stillness settled over the room. "And someone," Miss Marple said softly, "could not bear that possibility." Inspector Finch leaned forward slightly. "You believe Meredith's murder was committed to keep Gladys in Marlacombe?" Gladys gave a faint sound. "No." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly around the room. "Julian Meredith was killed impulsively during an argument, hidden hastily, then concealed permanently afterward by someone convinced the act had been necessary." Dr. Greaves spoke sharply. "Necessary?" Miss Marple looked at him quietly. "My dear doctor, human beings justify almost anything where love is concerned." No one spoke. Then Miss Marple added, "And years later Arthur Pritchard discovered the truth." The room felt utterly motionless now. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "Arthur Pritchard learned not merely that Meredith had died. He learned who killed him." Inspector Finch watched her closely. "And Clara Whitmore." Poor Clara overheard enough afterward to become dangerous as well. Miss Marple moved toward the dead fireplace. The hidden letter fragment was part of correspondence concerning Gladys's true identity. Pritchard concealed it here temporarily while deciding what to do. She touched the mantle lightly. The murderer searched the chimney afterward, attempting to recover it. That is why soot appeared before the body was even discovered. Inspector Finch nodded slowly.
Yes.
Miss Marple turned, and tonight, she said gently, we possess the final surviving portion of that same letter. Several people looked sharply up. Inspector Finch stared. Miss Marple reached calmly toward the writing desk and lifted a sealed envelope. In here, she said, is the remaining evidence identifying the murderer beyond doubt. That was the bait. Miss Marple saw the reaction immediately. Not in words, not even in movement. In eyes, one pair of eyes fixed upon the envelope with sudden naked terror, then looked away too quickly. Miss Marple knew, completely now. Inspector Finch said carefully, "And where was this fragment discovered?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, if I told everyone that immediately, there would hardly be a point to the evening." A strained laugh escaped no one. Miss Marple placed the envelope deliberately upon the desk. "I suggest we all retire now. Inspector Finch and I have exhausted everyone enough for one night." Finch blinked slightly, but caught her meaning at once. "Yes," he said slowly.
"Quite?"
The gathering dissolved awkwardly. People left in uneasy silence. Sir Edmund guided Lady Rose gently from the room. Dr. Greaves departed, frowning heavily. Gladys lingered only a moment before following the others upstairs. Gerald Fenwick remained last. As he passed Miss Marple, he paused. "You know," he said quietly. "Yes," said Miss Marple. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he left without another word. Only Inspector Finch and Miss Marple remained hidden afterward in the dark morning-room adjoining the library. The connecting door stood slightly open. Beyond it, the library rested dimly lit in silence. The envelope remained visible atop the desk. Inspector Finch whispered, "You're certain? And they'll come back for it?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "My dear Inspector, frightened people always return to danger eventually, especially when they believe salvation lies there." Minutes passed. The grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight. Rain whispered faintly against the windows. Then at last came footsteps, very cautious. The library door opened slowly. A figure entered. Miss Marple watched silently through the narrow gap. The figure crossed directly toward the desk without hesitation, not searching then. A hand reached immediately for the envelope. Inspector Finch moved at once. "Don't touch it!" The figure spun violently around. For one terrible moment nobody spoke. Then Gerald Fenwick said hoarsely,
"Oh, God."
Inspector Finch stepped fully into the library. Rain hissed softly beyond the windows, while the lamps cast long shadows across Gerald Fenwick's face. The young solicitor stood motionless beside the desk, the sealed envelope still clutched in one hand. He looked neither surprised nor defiant now, only exhausted. Miss Marple entered quietly behind the inspector. Gerald gave a hollow laugh. "I suppose I should have known you'd arrange something theatrical." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple gently, "human beings are theatrical quite enough by themselves." Inspector Finch extended his hand. The envelope. After a moment Gerald surrendered it silently. Finch opened the flap immediately. Inside lay only blank paper. Gerald stared. Then he laughed again, this time bitterly. "Of course." Miss Marple watched him sadly. "You came because you believed the final fragment identified the killer. And you could not risk that." Gerald closed his eyes briefly. "No." The room fell silent. At last Inspector Finch said sharply, "You murdered Arthur Pritchard?" Gerald looked up slowly. Lady Rose, who had evidently returned unnoticed and now stood frozen in the doorway, gave a faint cry. "No." Gerald turned toward her immediately. "Please don't." Sir Edmund appeared behind her, pale with shock. Miss Marple sighed. Sir Edmund appeared behind her, pale with shock. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. She had hoped to spare them this part. But truth rarely arrived tidily. Inspector Finch's voice hardened. "And Clara Whitmore?" Gerald's face changed completely then. Pain crossed it nakedly. The word barely emerged. Lady Rose covered her mouth in horror. Gerald looked at Miss Marple. "She told you?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "You did." Inspector Finch moved closer. "And Julian Meredith?" For the first time Gerald looked genuinely startled.
"Why?"
"You killed Meredith 8 years ago?" "No!" The answer came instantly, too instantly to be false. Miss Marple nodded quietly. "Yes, Gerald did not kill Julian Meredith." Inspector Finch frowned sharply. "Then who did?" Miss Marple's eyes rested upon Gerald. "My dear boy," she said gently, Perhaps you should explain Arthur Pritchard first. Gerald sank slowly into a chair beside the desk where the steward had died. For several moments he said nothing. Then at last, "Pritchard came to see me 3 weeks ago." The room remained utterly silent. He'd discovered the parish alteration, Gladys's real identity, everything. Gerald's hands trembled visibly now. He was frightened. Miss Marple nodded faintly. "He said someone else already knew the truth about Meredith," Inspector Finch said sharply. Gerald swallowed. "He wouldn't tell me. Only that the old scandal would destroy Lady Rose if exposed publicly now." Lady Rose whispered brokenly.
"Oh, dear God."
Gerald looked toward her miserably. "I didn't want you hurt." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was at last. Not greed, not hatred. The most dangerous motive of all. Gerald continued in a strained voice. "Pritchard intended forcing a confession from whoever killed Meredith. He kept saying the past had gone on too long." Inspector Finch frowned. "So why murder him?" Gerald stared down at his hands. "Because he told me Gladys might be taken away." Silence crashed across the room. Miss Marple saw Gladys herself appear slowly in the doorway behind Sir Edmund, pale and bewildered. Gerald looked at her helplessly. "He said once the truth emerged everything would change." Newspapers. "Claims against the estate, perhaps," Gladys whispered. "You killed him because of me?" Gerald's face twisted painfully. "I loved you." The girl stared at him in shock. Miss Marple had suspected as much for some time, not merely affection. The quiet, desperate devotion of a lonely man who had built his entire emotional life around another person. Gerald whispered. "I thought if Pritchard disappeared, if the letters vanished, you could keep Gladys safe," Miss Marple finished gently.
"Yes,"
Inspector Finch said grimly. "So you struck Pritchard during the argument?" Gerald nodded weakly. "He laughed at me, said I was sentimental." His voice shook now. "I only meant to stop him talking." Miss Marple thought sadly. Most murders begin exactly that way. Inspector Finch's expression hardened further. "And Clara Whitmore?" Gerald closed his eyes. "She saw me leaving the study." Lady Rose gave a faint sob. Gerald spoke rapidly now, as though the words had waited too long already. "She came to me afterward terrified. Said she understood everything." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "You loved Clara too?" Gerald stared at her.
"Wow."
"My dear boy," she said softly, not romantically perhaps, but deeply enough to make what followed unbearable. Tears appeared suddenly in Gerald's eyes. "She threatened to tell Finch, and you panicked." His voice broke completely. "I only wanted to frighten her. I stretched the cord across the stairs, so she'd fall and stay quiet for a few days, perhaps." Inspector Finch stared at him coldly. "She broke her neck." Gerald buried his face briefly in his hands. No one spoke for several moments afterward. Rain battered softly against the windows. The old library seemed filled suddenly with unbearable weariness. Two dead from fear, two dead from love, and beneath everything one older death still unresolved. At last Inspector Finch said, "That leaves Julian Meredith." Gerald looked up slowly. "I swear to God I never harmed him." Miss Marple nodded. Gerald only inherited the consequences afterward. Inspector Finch turned sharply toward her. "You know who killed Meredith." The room became still once more. Miss Marple looked quietly toward Lady Rose. "My dear," she said gently, "there is one person here who loved Gladys even more desperately than Gerald Fenwick." Lady Rose stared at her blankly. Then very slowly understanding began creeping across her face. "No." Miss Marple's eyes moved toward Sir Edmund Ashcombe. The old man stood utterly motionless beside the fireplace. Rain whispered against the windows. No one breathed. Then Sir Edmund said quietly. Rose gave a low, broken cry. "No!" But Sir Edmund Ashcombe did not look at her. He stood beside the cold fireplace with one hand resting heavily upon the mantel, his face grey with exhaustion and something beyond exhaustion. Now the terrible relief that sometimes follows the end of concealment. Miss Marple watched him quietly, not triumphantly. Never that. There was nothing triumphant in the ruin of a human life. Inspector Finch spoke at last. "You killed Julian Meredith." Sir Edmund nodded once. The room remained utterly silent except for the rain against the windows and the faint ticking of the clock upon the shelf. Gladys Trent stared at him in disbelief. Sir Edmund looked toward her then, and Miss Marple saw immediately what had made the truth so difficult to perceive from the beginning. Not possessiveness alone, not guilt, Love built slowly over decades in the ordinary rhythms of village life. The sight of a child at fêtes and Christmas services, school prizes, birthday parcels sent anonymously, concern hidden beneath distance, a fatherhood never acknowledged yet fully lived. Sir Edmund said quietly, "I never intended anyone to know." Sir Edmund said quietly, "I never intended anyone to know." Miss Marple thought. Number. That part at least was true. Inspector Finch remained very still. "Tell us exactly what happened." Sir Edmund closed his eyes briefly before speaking. "When Julian disappeared before the wedding, I believed he had abandoned Rosalie deliberately." Lady Rose bowed her head silently. "I married her because someone had to protect her. In those days," he stopped tiredly. "Well, society could be merciless." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Especially to women." Sir Edmund continued, "When the child was born, Beatrice arranged the adoption through the Trents. I thought it kinder for everyone." Gladys looked pale and stricken. "But you watched over me anyway." Sir Edmund's voice softened almost imperceptibly. A silence followed. 8 years ago Julian Meredith returned," Inspector Finch said sharply. "At the vicarage." Sir Edmund's jaw tightened. "He wanted money at first. Then he demanded Gladys." Lady Rose gasped softly. "He said he intended taking her abroad with him and his new family." Miss Marple saw Gladys flinch visibly. Poor child. One spent a lifetime imagining lost parents nobly. Reality rarely proves so considerate. Sir Edmund spoke more heavily now. Julian was charming, selfish. He treated people as possessions to reclaim whenever convenient. Miss Marple believed that too, because such men existed everywhere. Perfectly pleasant at dinner parties, perfectly ruinous to those who loved them. Inspector Finch's voice hardened. "So you argued?" Sir Edmund looked toward the dark windows. "I met him secretly at the old boathouse after midnight. I intended paying him to disappear permanently. And instead, he laughed at me." The words emerged with quiet bitterness. "He said Gladys belonged to him by right, that Rosalie had no claim upon her after abandoning her." Lady Rose covered her face. Sir Edmund's expression changed then, not into anger exactly, but remembered horror. "He said he would take her whether we consented or not." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the true motive at last. Not scandal, not inheritance. The threat of losing the child he had protected for 25 years. Sir Edmund whispered. "I struck him," Inspector Finch said quietly. "With what?" "A boat-hook." The room seemed colder suddenly. Sir Edmund stared into the dead fireplace. "I did not mean to kill him immediately, but he fell badly against the stone edge. And afterward?" Sir Edmund's voice became dull. "Beatrice helped me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Of course she had. Loyalty again. Always loyalty." "We buried the body temporarily near the orchard," Sir Edmund continued. "Later we moved him into the trunk." Inspector Finch frowned. "Why keep the body at all?" Sir Edmund gave a tired, hopeless smile. "Because once you commit one terrible act, you spend years convincing yourself you can still control the consequences." Miss Marple thought that an unusually truthful statement. Gladys stood motionless near the doorway. "You killed my father." Sir Edmund looked at her steadily. "And all these years, I loved you." The simplicity of it filled the room more completely than any dramatic declaration could have done. Gladys began to cry silently. Not loudly, not theatrically, simply with the quiet bewilderment of someone whose entire understanding of love and betrayal had collapsed simultaneously. Lady Rose rose shakily and crossed toward her. "My darling!" But Gladys stepped backward instinctively. The movement wounded Lady Rose more visibly than any accusation. Miss Marple looked away. There were some griefs one ought not witness too closely. Inspector Finch spoke again after a moment. "Arthur Pritchard discovered the truth recently." "Yes," said Sir Edmund heavily. "He recognized Julian's watch chain when the trunk strap broke during repairs." "And Lady Beatrice?" Sir Edmund closed his eyes. "She feared exposure terribly after Arthur began asking questions." Miss Marple intervened softly. "But she did not kill Arthur."
"No."
"Nor Clara." Sir Edmund looked toward Gerald Fenwick with immense sadness.
"No."
Gerald sat collapsed in the chair beside the desk, staring downward as though unable to bear his own thoughts any longer. Miss Marple felt pity for him too. One could condemn weakness while still understanding it. Indeed, understanding made condemnation harder. Inspector Finch moved toward Sir Edmund slowly. "You understand I must arrest you." Sir Edmund straightened slightly then, reclaiming something of his old dignity. "But before you do," He looked toward Gladys. "There is one thing you should know." The girl stared at him through tears. Sir Edmund said quietly, "Your mother never abandoned you." Not for one moment. Lady Rose broke down completely then, and Gladys, after one long trembling hesitation, crossed suddenly toward her. The two women clung to one another beside the fire while rain swept softly against the dark windows of Willowbrook Hall. Miss Marple turned her face away politely, because some reconciliations were too private for observation. Much later, after Inspector Finch had departed with Sir Edmund and the house had finally grown quiet, Miss Marple remained alone in the library. The fire had burned low. Only embers glowed softly now beneath the grate where Arthur Pritchard had once hidden the letter fragment that began everything. Or rather, Miss Marple reflected, everything that ended everything. Gerald Fenwick had been taken away separately. Lady Beatrice lay dead from loyalty. Julian Meredith dead from selfishness. Arthur Pritchard dead from curiosity. Clara Whitmore dead from fear. Such ordinary motives, such devastating consequences. Miss Marple sighed softly and resumed her knitting. Human nature, she reflected sadly, never truly changed. People loved too fiercely, feared too deeply, and protected one another far beyond reason. Outside, the rain finally began to ease over Marlicombe, and somewhere far off beyond the village lanes and dripping hedgerows, morning slowly approached. By the following morning, Marlicombe had already begun the slow and uncomfortable process by which villages recover from scandal. Curtains twitched discreetly. Voices lowered as people passed one another in the high street. The butcher's assistant carried gossip between shops with solemn importance, while Mrs. Phelps declared repeatedly that she had suspected emotional complications from the beginning, though no one could later recall her saying any such thing. Life resumed, as it always did, and yet something invisible had altered permanently beneath the ordinary routines of tea-trays, parish notices, and market deliveries. Miss Marple understood that perhaps better than anyone. She sat beside the window of her cottage that afternoon, with her knitting resting quietly in her lap, while pale autumn sunlight touched the garden path outside. The murders were solved. The guilty had confessed, and still no one truly felt victorious. Real tragedies seldom allowed such comfort. Inspector Finch visited shortly after 3 o'clock. He looked less tense than before, though profoundly tired. "Well," he said while accepting tea, "it's finally over." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, human sorrow is rarely over, merely quieter." Finch sighed. "You always manage to make resolutions sound depressing." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "Only truthful." He stirred his tea thoughtfully. "Sir Edmund signed a full confession this morning." Miss Marple nodded. "And Gerald Fenwick?" The inspector's face darkened slightly. "He's shattered. Keeps repeating Clara Whitmore's name." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yeah, I imagine he will for the rest of his life." Silence settled comfortably for a moment. Then Finch said, "You realize rather early that Gerald killed Pritchard." "Not early enough. What gave him away?" Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Love." The inspector blinked. "That seems rather vague." "My dear Inspector, nothing reveals human beings more clearly than the direction of their devotion." She resumed knitting calmly. Gerald watched Gladys constantly, not possessively, protectively. Everything frightened him where she was concerned. Finch nodded slowly. "And Clara?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "Poor Clara." She discovered Gerald's guilt and threatened exposure because she hoped saving him from further lies might somehow save him from himself. The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "You think she cared for him?" "Yes, and he killed her anyway." Miss Marple's needles paused. People who panic rarely understand the full horror of what they are doing until afterward. Later that evening Gladys Trent came to visit. She looked older somehow, not physically, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone forced suddenly into adulthood by truth. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly. "My dear child." Gladys sat near the fire in silence for a while before speaking. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "That is perfectly natural." The younger woman stared into the flames. "My mother writes me letters already." "Long ones?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "That sounds like Lady Rose." Gladys gave a faint laugh. "She keeps apologizing." "And Sir Edmund?" Gladys hesitated. "He asked whether I hated him." Miss Marple looked at her quietly. "Do you?" "I don't know." The answer came honestly and without drama. Miss Marple approved of that. Real emotion rarely arrived neatly organized, Gladys whispered. He murdered my father. But my father... She stopped uncertainly. My father would have taken me away from everything I knew. Miss Marple nodded softly. And Sir Edmund loved me. Tears filled Gladys's eyes suddenly. How can both things be true? Miss Marple set aside her knitting. My dear, she said gently, human beings are very seldom only one thing. Twilight settled gradually over Marleycombe. Smoke drifted upward from cottage chimneys, while the church bells marked the hour softly across the darkening village. Miss Marple and Gladys sat together quietly for some time. At last Gladys rose to leave. At the doorway she paused. Do you think life ever becomes simple again after something like this? Miss Marple smiled faintly. But it becomes livable. The girl nodded slowly. Then she left. Miss Marple remained standing by the window, watching her disappear along the lane beneath the fading autumn light. Poor child, yet perhaps not entirely poor. Truth, however painful, at least allowed people to begin living honestly. And honesty, Miss Marple reflected, was often underrated. Several weeks later, Willowbrook Hall stood quieter than before. Lady Rose had withdrawn largely from village society. Gerald Fenwick awaited trial in Much Benham. Inspector Finch returned to ordinary police work with visible relief. Only the seasons moved forward unchanged. Leaves fell. Rain came and passed. The village resumed its rhythms, and one crisp November morning Miss Marple received a letter. The handwriting belonged to Sir Edmund Ashcombe. She opened it slowly. Dear Miss Marple, I have spent many nights wondering whether I regret what I did. The answer, I think, is both yes and no. Julian Meredith did not deserve death. Yet if time reversed itself and I stood once more in that boathouse hearing him threaten to take Gladys away, I cannot truthfully say I would act differently. That, perhaps, is the worst punishment of all. Yours sincerely, Edmund Ashcombe. Miss Marple folded the letter quietly. Outside, frost silvered the garden hedges. Human beings, she thought sadly, rarely committed terrible acts because they were entirely wicked. Far more often they acted from love twisted by fear, and that made judgment infinitely harder. She placed the letter carefully into the fire. It burned slowly to ash. Then Miss Jane Marple resumed her knitting while morning sunlight crept gently across the room. And in Marleycombe, as in all villages everywhere, life continued.